Good morning. My name is Michelle Egan. I'm a global fellow in the Wilson Center here in Washington, D.C., one of the premier think tanks. I'm delighted to welcome you all today via Zoom for this wonderful, engaging event. And I would like to stress to the audience that you may submit questions at GEP, Global Environmental Global Europe at wilsoncenter.org. And if not, you can tweet us at Wilson Center GEP. So please don't forget to send us your questions, which we will try and get to in the second half of this session. And so welcome both. Good morning, good afternoon. We have a wonderful guest today, the Financial Times journalist, Philip Stevens, who has published what is effectively a wonderful book called Britain Alone, The Path from Suez to Brexit, published in 2021 with Faber Books. And he is the recipient of the British Political Journalist of the Year from the Political Studies Association, and also the Political Journalist of the Year from the British Press Awards. And he is the author of two previous books and is currently working on yet another book on Irish politics. So we have both this one to look forward to and a subsequent one. Welcome. I'd like to ask you a couple of general questions at the beginning, and then some specific questions about Europe, British politics, and transatlantic relationship. This is really a sobering but sweeping assessment of how a nation has struggled to define its global role. It's forced to reckon with the limits of its national power across many post-war decades. And it spans two sort of self-inflicted crises, Suez to Brexit, and how Britain has grappled with these challenges. And so I'm going to ask you, based on the title of the book, is this book about Britain alone, or is it also about British disengagement? You give insights about British disengagement from its imperial role, from its international security obligations, historically, Middle East, Asia, also its disengagement from Europe with Brexit. So I wonder the title and the purpose of the book.
Well, first of all, Michelle, thank you so much to Woodrow Wilson to having me, having me on this discussion. I mean, you're right, of course, that the book is about this, what seems, if you're, my age, an eternal struggle of successive British governments to work out where Britain fits in the world, its place in the world. The title, I think, reflects the fact that this is where we've ended up after all this time. We're more or less alone now. I'm not sure that that was a deliberate plan. And your comment made me reflect, perhaps I should have called the book Britain Lost, because it's really about a nation that's lost its way. I mean, right at the beginning of the book, I mention a British civil servant called Henry Tizard, who had worked for Churchill during the Second World War. And in the late 1940s, he became very concerned that we Brits just hadn't realized how much the world had changed during the war. We had, quotes, won the war, but we were bankrupt. The United States had established itself as the primary global power, and we faced this confrontation with the Soviet Union. But the British elites, political classes just didn't want to admit that. And what Tizard said was, look, we're a great nation still, but if we try to continue as a great power, we risk losing our status as a great nation. And what he was pointing to, which, as you said, is a sort of central theme of the book, which is the distance between our post-imperial ambitions to be a player on the world stage of global power and the reality of our own economic circumstances and the big shifts in power geopolitically across the world. I mean, the other, of course, person who pointed this out, 60 years ago now, was the American statesman Dean Acheson when he famously commented about Britain losing an empire and casting around and failing to find a role. Now, I think if those two gentlemen were alive today, they could make those two comments and they would be as apposite today after Brexit as they were in 1948 and 1962. We are a nation, I think, alone now. Of course, we have the relationship with the US, but we're more alone than we've been for a long time, and we're lost as well.
If we are lost, and you have these wonderful quotes throughout the book, it's a sobering book. What lessons does this sort of sobering, the history, the diplomacy, the politics, the economics, what could you provide in terms of lessons for the post-Brexit environment? Or what would Tizard or Acheson provide for the post-Brexit environment?
Well, I think Tizard would say now precisely the same thing. I mean, I personally, and I think most people in what you'd call the sort of foreign policy world in Britain would think, Brexit was a big mistake because we have pulled ourselves away from our neighbors, our principal Western allies in Europe, and also from our main investment and trading partnership. But now we've done that, I think what Tizard would say, and I think what Acheson would say is, okay, you've made this decision, now get real. When you think about your place in the world, for the first time since 1945, make sure you align those ambitions with the economic and geopolitical realities of the time. So, Britain is still, I'm not running down my own country, because Britain is still, in my view, a great nation. We have a big economy, 6th or 7th in the world. We have in European standards, a strong military. So it's not that we need to sort of, shrink back, but we must make sure that we don't keep repeating this mistake of thinking that we are one of the big three, as they used to be described during the Second World War, Russia or the Soviet Union, the US and the UK, but we are a significant European power with global interests, but not necessarily, or not the global reach that we once took for granted.
That's a really interesting, differentiation between global interest and global reach. And, the whole theme of the book, you have this sort of the perception of Britain's role in the world. Successive prime ministers have sort of tackled this issue. And you also talk about, there seems to be a lot of acts of national self-harm, not just Brexit in this book, but a lot of national. And so propping up the value and overvaluing of sterling, or the Suez intervention in 1956, or not joining the EU at Messina in 1955. So I wonder which of these key issues, because there were so many examples of national self-harm in the book that brought home to you the harsh realities of the diminished circumstances of the UK, perhaps, the still with the global reach and still an important economy, but, not one of the big three, so to speak.
Well, in the sort of 25 years or 30 years after the Second World War, even after Suez, which Suez in many respects was the last hurrah of empire, the last attempt to demonstrate, along with France and Israel in that instance, that militarily we could send forces across the world and do things without the United States, without the help or even the permission of the United States. That should have, and in many ways that did shatter many of the imperial illusions. But what we were left with was a power that still thought itself global. We still had troops in Southeast Asia. We were still decolonizing in Africa. So we still had this sense of ourselves as global. while at the same time our economic power was, in relative terms, was shrinking dramatically. So as you said, we had this succession. Propping up sterling was all to do with pretending that we were still, the world's second reserve currency, that sterling, although the dollar had taken over as the principal reserve currency, that sterling was still really a currency for people to hold throughout the world. And that was unsustainable. But it went on until, I think, the turning point was when we pulled back militarily from east of Suez in the early 1970s. And what I try to say in the book is that by joining the EU in 1973, that was the first time we'd really come to terms, I think, with the reality, because what we tried to do was to redefine ourselves as a European power, but as I said, a European power that had global interests and global connections, a huge diaspora, cultural and political connections with the former colonies. But we weren't a great power in the sense of the United States or the Soviet Union. So Europe, in a sense, was, in my view, the answer to the problem, in that it meant we were significant in our own neighborhood. We developed economically along with France and Germany and Italy, but it didn't preclude us from, if you like, with the United States and with others, operating in other parts of the world when our interests were affected.
And yet, one of the common dilemmas in this book is leaders of both the political party, Labour and Conservative. There's almost a lack of recognition about this shift in Britain's standing. And so which of the post-war leaders, I mean, you document everybody from Churchill to Eden, all the way through to Johnson. Which of these leaders in Britain's post-war period that you're looking at grasped most astutely their nation's diminished geopolitical role? Because some sort of felt in your book that they never could sort of, they never could reconcile themselves with that diminished role. So who do you think really grasped their, the nation's sort of, I think you said still having global interests, but not that big three role.
Well, I think you really put your finger on something there, because I think a number of them grasped it intellectually, but not many of them grasped it emotionally. So if you look at Harold Macmillan, he certainly intellectually grasped it, and he launched the first application. As you said earlier, we had scorned the common market when it was set up in Messina and established by the Treaty of Rome in 1956. But by 1962, Harold Macmillan was trying to get Britain into the EU. He was stymied by Charles de Gaulle, General de Gaulle in France, and so was Harold Wilson, who followed him in 1967. So they intellectually had understood that Britain couldn't separate its interests economically, politically, or security from those of its European neighbors. But emotionally, they still felt that they wanted to retain this sense that, that our vision, our perspective went beyond our own, beyond our own continent. And the central difference between Britain and the other members of the EU all the way through is that the others had a reason, a big reason to be part of the common market and then the European Union. For France and Germany, it was reconciliation. For Germany, it was rebuilding its economy and its political legitimacy. For France, it was political leadership in Europe. It thought that was the way. And for Italy, it was just holding the state together. And as we went on, for Spain and Portugal, they all had big political. Britain joined rather resentfully. We joined because we felt we had to, not because we really wanted to, in the sense of we wanted to be part of this project. We felt that we didn't have a choice, so we better just join it. And so, although we Edward Heath, we had one prime minister, Edward Heath, the prime minister who took us into the EU in 1973, who truly believed in our role in Europe and saw for us a leadership role in Europe along with France and Germany. Margaret Thatcher, in her early years, I mean, this surprises some people, was really quite passionately pro-European, and she saw it as a political opportunity. But as time went by, and the other, central player in the book, of course, is the United States and the special relationship, she was pulled back across the Atlantic into the Atlanticist sort of position. Tony Blair, I would thought, in the 1990s, he spent some time rebuilding bridges with Europe and rebuilding a role for Britain in the European Union, and with Schroeder in Germany and with Chirac in France, had some success. But then came along the Iraq War, and that effort was broken because we, as we always done, I think, since 1945, if faced with a choice between Europe and the United States, we jumped the way of the United States.
That raises a really interesting set of questions in the book, and I'm glad you picked on Ted Heath, and I'm going to come back to him. But at different points in the book, there's a sense that Britain could have been a central player in Europe. And you've mentioned, early Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair. It almost feels like you're saying that could have been something else, not just a Franco-German axis. And you point out that in some ways, Thatcher was a Gaullist. She liked the sort of intergovernmental, not a federal vision of Europe. And then, she could have been tied to Kohl because, he was both an Atlanticist and a Europeanist, and he was at ease with both, that relationship. And I think you have a phrase in there that said, might have been a joint architects in a different Europe. And I wondered if you could talk about that. You're talking a little bit, you mentioned a little bit about the missed opportunities, but was there at any point a possibility of something different than the Franco-German governing Europe?
Yeah, and I think as I said, I think there were two critical points. One was 79 when Thatcher came to power, and she came to power with a very large majority, very strong mandate from the British people, and the Labour Party was shattered. So it was pretty clear that she was going to be, or she could hope to be a two-term rather than just a one-term prime minister. And she had argued passionately for Europe in its and I think the phrase she used as an organization that opens doors on the world that for otherwise would be closing for us. And she at the beginning could have taken the view, look, that what Europe needs, particularly as it was beginning then to expand, is a sort of directoire, as it were, of the three powerful countries, France, Germany, and the UK. And that's what I'm going to aim for. And I'm going to not reduce my commitment to the transatlantic relationship, but I'm going to accompany that commitment with a much stronger presence in Europe. And I think she could have done that in 79. For various reasons, she chose not to, partly because anti-communism pulled her even more sharply in the direction of Ronald Reagan, partly because we had this dispute about our contributions to the European budget, which escalated completely out of control and lasted 3 or 4 years. So I think that was one miss. The other was Blair, as I said, in 97, again, a prime minister coming in with a huge majority. And Blair was, more an intuitive pro-European than most of his predecessors. He'd spent time as a student working in a bar in Paris with passable French. And he, early on was saying, well, look, why do we think there's a contradiction between being pro-American and pro-European. There's no need to be that contradiction. We can be both. He signed an agreement with the French, the Saint-Malo Agreement, which was the first real agreement to formalize Franco-British defense cooperation. Admittedly, the US administration was a little bit worried about it, but it sort of worked. And that was, I think, probably even more so than the Thatcher opportunity, a chance for us to say, look, we can be, as I said right at the beginning, we can be Europeans, Atlanticists, and have a global perspective all at the same time. And I think had the Iraq War not come, had, obviously, the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and had the Iraq War not followed the Afghan War, I think you could write a sort of, counter history that said, Britain moved further into Europe, even as it remained a very strong ally of the US. And increasingly, it's interesting here that the US, that's what the US wanted, in a way, that it wanted, Britain to be strong in Europe because it was a voice for many of the same values of successive US administrations.
It almost feels like, in talking about those three, global reach, the Atlanticist, the Europeanist, it almost feels like Churchill's three concentric circles of foreign policy.
But we're not the central. It is, but Churchill's imagination was that we sat one of the central players. Mine is that we could be considerable players as long as we joined with other Europeans.
That's a great differentiation. The one person who I find you have sympathy for in the book, and maybe perhaps this is just my read, is the person who you describe as reordering foreign policy, but it didn't seem to last, and that's Ted Heath. And he feels, I suppose, thinking about the transformation of the Republican Party in the United States and thinking about the transformation of the Conservative Party in Britain, he probably wouldn't have a role anymore in the contemporary Conservative Party. He'd be marginalized or not even in the party. So why was his vision so short-lived? What can you tell us about Ted Heath? Because we hear so much about Euroscepticism with Nigel Farage and others, but Heath is a sympathetic figure in your book, perhaps.
I think Ted Heath had a lot of domestic economic problems, and his domestic policy was not the most adroit, the smartest, and he tried to take on the trade unions at a difficult time, the oil price crisis, whatever, and lost. So in a way, his reputation, certainly in British histories of the period, is coloured by the fact that he failed, quotes, domestically. His European policy, I do have admiration, because while Macmillan, as I said, was intellectually prepared to accept that we had to be part of this European enterprise, he wasn't emotionally prepared. And the same with Harold Wilson, the Labour Prime Minister, and the same, I think, later of Margaret Thatcher and others. Heath was prepared to say, look, we can be a powerful European nation. We can be part, going back to your point, part of this, the leadership of Europe. And that of itself will leverage influence across the world. He understood that if Britain and Germany and France all went to Washington with the same point of view, that was a stronger presentation than just the UK going to Washington. He understood that if those three nations together wanted a certain policy in the Middle East or in Africa, together they had the military and the economic heft to deliver it. So I mean, I do admire him because he was honest about it. He was, sometimes we Brits get slightly embarrassed that when, you know, the special relationship with the United States looks really a bit like a supine relationship, that it looks like we're nodding yes too often to Washington. And Heath, you know, staked out his independence. He didn't go rushing off to the White House to see Richard Nixon as soon as he got elected. In fact, he waited for Nixon to come and visit him in his country house in Chequers. And he took on Henry Kissinger. At one point, Kissinger got so irritated with Heath for coordinating policy in Europe that he engineered the ending of intelligence cooperation for a brief period. It was weeks, you know, rather than longer. But you know, it was good, I think, to see then a prime minister with a realistic view of what Britain could do, and an understanding that our foreign policy is shaped, you know, significantly by geography and economic interest, as well as political aspiration. So yeah, I think Heath is an underrated, in foreign policy at least, a much underrated prime minister.
It brings to mind sort of if he was Rip Van Winkle and he woke up and saw the EU +3 negotiating on the Iran deal and the United States coming to the table, the culmination of his vision.
Yeah,
so
precisely.
I'm struck by that.
Yeah, you've got it. That's absolutely, and that's absolutely right, precisely.
And I two final questions, and I'll then see if there's any questions from the audience. But I suppose there has to be a parallel in your book here between, you know, Harold Wilson comes in and calls a referendum on Britain's membership of the EU. And then Cameron does the same thing, basically for, you know, inter-party, you know, Conservative Party, you know, the damn problem of Europe in 2015, 2016. Both of them got some concessions from Europe, not huge concessions, but marginal. Why was one, I mean, I suppose it's an obvious question, but why was one successful and one not? And what was the differences between these two, you know, efforts at, you know, negotiating with Europe and then sort of dealing with the Europe question?
I think you're right about these similarities. Harold Wilson's Labour Party was a split over Europe as Cameron's Conservative in 1975, as Cameron's Conservative Party was in 2016. And I think, as I recall, a majority of Labour MPs in 75 were against Britain remaining in the EU. I think the difference, though, was that, first of all, Wilson was much smarter about the renegotiation. He understood that you don't go into a negotiation like that, where you're going to have a referendum on the outcome, unless you know that you're going to win. And the way that you're going to win is by setting your sights at a level that you know the other side can meet. So Wilson went in with a series of demands of the EU that he knew, and there'd been lots of diplomatic contact beforehand, that after some fighting and ritual, you know, denunciations, the other side would meet. So he could come out and claim his renegotiation a victory, although it didn't amount to much, but he hadn't asked for much. Cameron really didn't quite know what he wanted. He wanted something on to halt immigration. Some other things which were to do with the City of London, which were to do protecting the interest. Now, you know, for ordinary voting people, these were not, you know, this wasn't something that was front of mind. So Cameron's negotiation was ill thought out, and it failed. He went to Merkel and said, you know, give me some new powers to restrict immigration, and she said no, because that would have torn up the basic architecture of the rest of the EU. But then secondly, I think that, you know, we the circumstances were different in the sense that we had this rising populism through, from the end of the financial crash through austerity, which was, Brexit wasn't just about Europe. Brexit was about a revolt by particularly those, we call them the left behinds, those people who thought they'd been excluded from globalization by the advances of technology. So it was revenge on the elites. And we saw something of the same mood in Britain in 2016 as we did in the United States in 2016 when Donald Trump, came to power. So in that sense, Cameron had a tougher job and made a mess of it.
It's interesting you talk about the politics of grievance. What we're going to advertise now, before I ask and dominate all the questions, is whether we have any questions from the audience. Please tweet us at Wilson Center GEP, or send us a question at gep@wilsoncenter.org. While I'm waiting for a couple of questions to come in we have several hundred people in the audience here, I wanted to go back to the politics of grievance. And so two things, the politics of grievance, given what was happening in the 1970s, the strikes, the unions and everything else, it's really interesting that Europe wasn't blamed then for a lot of those circumstances. And I suppose that raises the question for me, because it could have been like that in the 1970s. The politics of grievance was certainly there, the austerity, the economic pressures and the oil crisis and so forth. I suppose, when do you think that Brexit, in the sense of a political goal, started? Would it be with Maastricht? When would you pinpoint that in your sort of, really long sort of diplomatic, economic, geopolitical history here?
I think it started, you're right, as a project with around 1990. And I think the two key pillars of the beginning of it were the fall of Margaret Thatcher and the Maastricht Treaty. Now, Thatcher by 1990, when she was basically defenestrated from her own party, but from the leadership by her own party, because she'd become too hostile to Europe. Mm-hmm. In fact, as we saw later, it was hostility to German unification as much as to the EU. But she became, from becoming a Eurosceptic, she became really quite hostile to Europe. And then the Maastricht Treaty, which set up the single currency, or prepared the way for the single currency, involved another transfer of powers, or pooling of sovereignty, I would call it, to Brussels, and a new level of ambition for the European Union in terms of combining some of our security and judicial affairs policies and foreign policy. So on the one hand, you had the EU in a moment of exuberance, as it were, and confidence, saying, we're going to forge ahead. On the other hand, you had Margaret Thatcher and a growing band of conservatives saying, this is a danger to British sovereignty and identity, etc. So I think that was the beginning. I mean, the really strange thing for me in a lot of this is that if you look at what the EU has done in the last 30 years, there have been three big projects. One was the creation of a single market. One was the extension of the EU to the former communist states, Central and Eastern Europe, opening the doors to these new democracies. And the third was the single currency. Now, of the first two, Britain would claim that it was a principal architect. Thatcher pushed the single currency. Thatcher, Major, Tony Blair and others all pushed the East European strategy. And the third one, the Euro, which British politicians haven't liked, we were given an opt-out of. So in a different world, British politicians should be claiming, and some of my German friends say this to me, why weren't you, why wasn't Cameron claiming victory, saying these were conservative projects and the one project we don't like, we're outside it, it doesn't affect us. So what the Conservatives came to see as defeat were actually, in their own terms, victories.
That's, that raises the whole issue about, a lot of the focus of the book is on, the cabinet, Whitehall, prime ministers and their dealings both internally and externally. But what that raises for me is an interesting observation about British political class has never engaged the general public. And that seems to me, they've never sold Europe to the general public. For Britain, it's always seems to be very, you use the phrase common market at one point, which is a very British phrase. I wonder if the British have just seen this as transactional, and that's what differentiates them, as you pointed out, from other member states.
I think so, and I think you're right, and I think you put your finger on something, and this we saw reflected back at the politicians in much of the media, a lot of which, including Rupert Murdoch's newspapers, were hostile to the whole European enterprise in the last 20, 30 years. They've seen it as a zero-sum game. A British minister goes off to Brussels for a meeting, and it's whether he or she gets for Britain what we want, rather than, as many other countries, look, we all have national interests and we all press them. But we haven't claimed European policies as victories, even when they have been policies that we have initiated. And it has been, there is this disjunction, and there always has been on Europe between the elites and, ordinary working voters and whatever. I think the biggest disjunction, though, was the one before Brexit that we saw, not just in Britain, but across the rich democracies, between, working people and elites everywhere. And as I said, the Brexit vote was, about Europe, but also about the fact that wages had been stagnating for 10 or 15 years, that people's secured jobs in advanced manufacturing or in manufacturing plants had been replaced by insecure jobs, delivering meals or, working in warehouses. So that gulf, I think, between there was always a gulf about Europe, but the real gulf, I think, in 2016 was between a substantial section of the population who thought they'd been left behind by globalization and all the rest, and elites who thought, well, people will just do as we, tell them in terms of it's economically sensible to stay in the EU. I mean, the David Cameron's, campaign in 2016 was really about, well, you'd be silly to leave the EU because economically we're better off in the EU. Now that's true, but it didn't at all connect with those people who thought, well, economically they had lost everything anyway, or lost most. So, this was a free hit, as it were, against the government.
And it really reflects the geography of Britain, or the United Kingdom, I should say. So much it's a really unbalanced economy centered around London and the financial sector and service sector. And so, if you're working out of London, you don't see, I'm from Liverpool, you don't see that, the politics of grievance or the stagnation. You mentioned national interest, and I'm still hoping that people will give a question to us here. from the audience, but I wanted to sort of raise one more British question. And because we have an American audience, a couple of US questions, if nobody responds. And you mentioned that Britain was tied very much and looked at Europe in terms of national interest. And you see that even though they could have claimed credit for enlargement or the single market or digital issues or any of these things. And I wonder if that philosophy, perhaps of not understanding the sense of community or solidarity in Europe, is how the current government is negotiating. They've signed an agreement very much driven by national interest, and it's almost like they feel that they can reopen that agreement based on national interest. Do you think it's a misunderstanding of how the EU works?
It's a complete misunderstanding. It's really, it's much more to do with sort of political posturing than with foreign policy or with, a sensible realization of how Britain has to behave in the next, the fact that we've left the EU does not mean that we've left Europe. The truth is that 45 to 50% of our trade and investment flows are still with the European Union. The truth is the biggest threats to Britain, whether from Vladimir Putin's Russia, from terrorism coming from the Middle East and North Africa, whether international criminality or unrestricted migration, all the main threats to Britain are ones that we share with our European neighbors. But the government under its present Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who, it must be said, doesn't take a terribly strategic view of these things, is behaving as if we can sign a treaty, as you say. I'd be rather harsher than you and then renege on it to say, well, what he's basically saying to the EU now is that, well, I signed that treaty, that protocol about Ireland, because I was under a lot of pressure in Parliament and I was worried that I wouldn't get the whole of the treaty through. So I signed it just because, it made it easier for me, but now I don't like it, so I can unsign it. And understandably, the rest of the EU says, look, this is an international treaty. It's lodged at the United Nations. You can't just, everything can be renegotiated by willing partners, but you can't just, one partner can't come along and say, tear it up. So we are now in a really, I think, bad and dangerous place for Britain with our EU partners, because not only have we left the EU, but it's been a very angry and bitter divorce. And we are going to, at some point, to have to repair these relationships. And it's, from today's perspective, that's going to be a long time. And frankly, I don't think it's going to happen under this government. I don't think there's sufficient trust in Boris Johnson in Berlin or Paris or Brussels or Rome for any sort of reconciliation between the two. And of course, it's also raised, the approach the government's taken has raised questions internally for Britain, as it were, because it's reopened the Irish question about United Ireland, and it's also raised the question about whether Scotland will have another vote for independence, and unlike in 1914, might this time actually vote for independence. So, leaving the European Union in the end could lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom Union.
It almost seems that we call them in your book One Nation Tories, who could be responsible for the breakup of Britain. I wonder if this lack of trust and the concern about reneging on international commitments, as we have a US audience, what lessons should an American policymaker take from this book about Britain or Brexit?
Well, on the one hand, a hard-headed American policymaker can and should take the view that since Britain has nowhere else to go now in terms of it doesn't really have any other allies, the United States can be pretty tough in demanding that, the support of the US in the policies that it pursues. And what you've seen, I think, very interestingly, even in the last few months, is how the British government, which was a few years ago pursuing a, quote, pro-China policy, has now fallen in very behind the position of the Biden administration on being tough towards China. And that I think, and this agreement about the submarines with Australia and the US and new security arrangements, is a signal that I think that Britain feels now that it has to follow the US lead. On the other hand, Britain, of course, isn't as useful to a US president anymore because, in the past, Britain would often carry a US message into the councils of Europe. So speaking for, if you like, for open trade, for deregulation, for a tough line against international terrorism, Britain was really, in some respects, an American voice in the Council of Europe. But it's no longer that voice, it's lost that voice. So I would say that, if I was taking a really just national interest, hard-headed view as an American, I would say, on the one hand, Britain is a more pliant ally, but on the other hand, it's a less useful ally. Now, the question is now, I think, is whether the Ireland question, where Joe Biden has a personal as well as a serious political interest in not allowing Boris Johnson to upset the Belfast or the Good Friday peace agreement, whether that creates a real breach between Washington and London. At the moment, I think that Johnson has been pushing as far as he possibly could to try to unravel the agreement that was signed. The question is whether the EU has made a new offer to him, which keeps the agreement but reinterprets the way that it's actually implemented. If he doesn't take that agreement and this sore continues to fester, then I think we might well see the US administration, taking a really quite tough line with the UK over this issue.
That's a really, it's a very interesting and observation, especially in terms of both Joe Biden's background, but also we have a lot of Atlanticists that Biden has appointed in his administration. We do have a question from a colleague at George Washington University, Joanna Spear. And it's a great one we haven't cut on. Please discuss Britain's relationship with Commonwealth countries and why Johnson has chosen to cut development aid when it would seem after Brexit, these relationships were more important.
Well, I mean, that is a very good question, and I'd like to pose it to the Prime Minister myself. Because on the one hand, as you say, we have said, I mean, it's always been a little bit of a delusion that Britain has, a huge amount of influence in these, in its former colonial, possessions, as it were, because although these Commonwealth states obviously have strong cultural, in some cases economic ties with the UK, they have their own foreign policies and their own interests to pursue. So the idea that India, for example, would feel bound by the Commonwealth in any way, I think is absurd in setting its own foreign policy. But yes, one of the ambitions of the government was to say we are going to put more effort into these relationships and build up new bilateral relationships or renew the bilateral relationships with our Commonwealth partners. And then because of economic expediency, cuts development aid, which is one of the, Britain, had established a position in the world of development as, because it met the UN target and very few other countries did, it had established a leadership position in the world of development, and it undercut it because the Treasury wanted the money. But this, takes us back to our theme, these grand ambitions pulled into line, you could say, by economic realities. We want to do this, but we can't afford it.
That we want to, the ambition versus the cost is a great segue into, you have this notion at the end of the book that Britain post-Brexit doesn't have a grand strategy, to use, which we use here in Washington. And I wondered, this division that you mentioned in development aid also seems to reflect past policy choices as well. Foreign and defense policy has been tied to the nuclear deterrent, the nuclear power, and you have an implicit criticism of that strategy. Almost, this is the ambition, we want to be a nuclear player, but we're dependent on the United States, but we can't afford it. And I think it seems to me that what you're seeing in development is happening in the nuclear debate. You saw that through all your Polaris and Trident in your book. And I wonder how much as well, a lot of your thinking here is about past policy choices, the choices Britain made in terms of maintaining sterling as a global currency, of choosing a nuclear deterrent as, the foreign policy choice. And I wonder how much that, the ambition it has and the cost really have caused Britain long-term problems.
And will continue. The government published only this year, what it called a comprehensive review of our foreign and defense and security strategy. But it wasn't that, there was no strategy in it. It was basically setting out all the ambitions, analyzing rather elegantly what was happening in the world, but not setting the priorities and taking the decisions that would align those priorities with the reality of our power. And you're right about the formation of our defenses, our military, because we've wanted to sort of retain the illusion that we're a full spectrum power, almost what I would call a pocket superpower. Instead of focusing our military resources, our sizable but constrained military resources in areas where we can make a real difference, we've spent a lot of them on these big prestige things. First is the nuclear deterrent, and the second is these aircraft carriers, which we've recently launched, one of which we sent to the South China Sea. And I'll just talk about those for a minute first, because the aircraft carrier Queen Elizabeth really does sum up this dilemma. We've launched this very modern, very sophisticated aircraft carrier. I mean, it is smaller than most American ones, but it's more sophisticated than most American carriers. We've bought F-35 aircraft to fly off it, the best aircraft that the US now produces. But you know what? We cannot afford enough planes. We've learned, we've got to the stage where we've spent all this money, but we've realized we can't afford enough F-35. So the aircraft carrier Queen Elizabeth is in the Western Pacific now with 18 F-35s sitting on its deck, and 10 of them are operated by the US Marines, only 8 by the Royal Air Force. So this shows you the sort of how, now the nuclear, we're just about to upgrade Trident for the second or third time, and we refuse to ask, while we're cutting the army to about 60, 70,000 soldiers. we refuse as a nation to ask ourselves, is it sensible? And we cut the Navy dramatically in terms of frigates. Is it sensible to be spending 30, 40, 50 billion pounds on the nuclear deterrent when we could actually more effectively spend this money on a more effective, sizable Navy, better ground forces, on a better air force? And it's all tied up in prestige. The politicians, won't dream of saying, let's have a debate about the nuclear deterrent, because that would seem like, well, if we didn't have a deterrent, well, France would have one and we wouldn't. So that would make us look weaker. So, we, at some point in the next few years, and I think sadly it will be when there's another government, maybe of the same political complexion, but with a different prime minister, we're not going to have this really serious debate about how we deploy the resources we have in military, in terms of our military strength.
And we have an excellent question about which we have not touched on. How does NATO this, if at all, in terms of your vision of, because your title is Britain alone, and then we seem to have had investment in nuclear and not in the traditional, naval, and we've been cutting defense. So how do you think that plays a role?
Well, NATO is more important to us now than it's ever been, because it's outside Europe. It's the last sort of security forum in which we talk to our fellow Europeans as well as to the United States, and it's it remains the centerpiece of our defense. But at a time when the United States is saying, look, we the US want to put more of our focus on Asia, on China, the Pacific, and we want you Europeans to do more in your own backyard. You should be doing the stuff in North Africa, and you're going to have to do more in the Middle East because we're pulling out. These are not NATO areas, so it's we are absolutely 500% committed to NATO, but we have to reconcile that to the fact that although the United States under this administration is indeed committed to NATO, it's not as interested in NATO because NATO doesn't have a China, it doesn't have a China policy, as it were. NATO isn't in there, isn't in the Western Pacific. So NATO in some sense has become, well, certainly for the US, becomes less important, but more important for the UK now that we've excluded ourselves from discussions on defense with the European Union, even though the EU 27 said during the Brexit negotiations, even after you've left the European Union, if you want to remain part of the discussion about security and defense and foreign policy, we can think of other ways, other arrangements to do that. But Boris Johnson decided, no, we can do all this on our own, Britain alone, and walked off the European field.
What a fascinating book. We're coming close to the end of the time period, and we've sort of done justice to this book. And I want to give you a couple of minutes to say anything you feel we've missed out on. And I will make two observations to those who are still reluctant to buy the book. First of all, this isn't just a book that you've been sitting at the sidelines and observing and interviewing people. This is a book that is deeply researched, and there are a group and handful of books on post-war British politics that are worth reading. And this sits with Hugo Young, Peter Hennessy, Stephen Wall, and now I would certainly put Britain Alone on my bookshelf. So is there anything that you want to conclude with at the end of the session?
Well, Michelle, that's so generous of you, and thank you very much. And thank you again for the conversation, which I found fascinating. And I, as I said earlier, I hope to maybe visit you when I come to Washington to research my my next book. I think I would say, which is, it's not so much about the book, it would be a plea to Americans, which is, don't give up on us yet. I would say we're going through a sort of, Britain's going through a sort of peculiar sort of spasm, a period rather like, as you drew the parallel with the 1970s, where we lost our way. We've lost our way. I am hopeful and confident that in a few years or so, we will re-find our way, and we will realize, even if we don't rejoin the EU, we will realize that our relationship with our European neighbors is critical to our prosperity and security, and is a relationship that we can have cordially while maintaining and sustaining a strong relationship with the US. So I'm not defeatist about it. I think, as you said, this is a sort of pretty cautionary tale in the book, and it shows that, it says that we've ended up in a pretty bad place, but it's a place I think that Britain can escape from, even if we have to wait a little while yet.
And I think that closes almost where we are. And I would like to commend you on starting off by talking about Dean Acheson's famous quote that is often talked about in diplomatic circles, but to also bring us to a much lesser known figure, Tizard. And interestingly enough, Americans, I hope, will rediscover him, because there was an exhibit a few years ago on, I think, the fundamental issue here that bringing all of those blueprints and technology in the late 30s, 40s to the United States and exchanging that technology on radar and other important issues, I think was reflective of both a great nation and the importance of the special relationship that Britain had. So I commend everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much.